My name is Todd Sechser. I'm a professor in the Department of Politics and at the Batten School, as well as a senior fellow at the Miller Center. I've been teaching courses about international politics and international security for about 15 years here at UVA, asking questions about how nuclear weapons have reshaped war and diplomacy. When I first arrived at UVA, nuclear security was not a particularly popular subject for scholars and professors like me to study. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed back in the early 1990s, nuclear issues were really relegated in academia, mostly to the back burner. After half a century of living under the constant threat of nuclear attack and nuclear war, academics, as well as government officials and the public at large, really were all too happy to stop worrying about questions of nuclear deterrence and nuclear strategy. Beyond the efforts of a few rogue countries, as they were called back in the 1990s, to build crude nuclear weapons, for the most part, in academia and in many circles of the government, we stopped paying attention to nuclear security issues for many years. But today, as we know, those issues are very much back in vogue. There are at least, probably more, but at least 4 significant stories about nuclear weapons that you're reading about in the news today. First comes from the news from literally today, and that has to do with North Korea's nuclear program. North Korea first successfully tested a nuclear weapon back in 2006. So it's been now almost 15 years since their first successful nuclear test. And for a good decade after that, North Korea was really mocked as a technologically backward pariah state full of bluster, but without any significant nuclear capability. A nuclear power perhaps, but not one to be taken all that seriously. Those days are long over, needless to say. In 2017, North Korea tested an intercontinental ballistic missile that we think might be able to hit the east coast of the United States and maybe even further, as well as a nuclear weapon, as I mentioned, that was an order of magnitude more powerful than anything that we thought that they were capable of. And that was 4 years ago. And in the meantime, the North Koreans have only advanced their nuclear capabilities. You probably remember over the last couple of years that the United States engaged in 2 major summits with the North Koreans, the second one ending with the United States actually walking out. The first one ending with only a vague agreement that North Korea and the United States would work toward denuclearizing the Korean peninsula, but no real firm commitments on either side. So despite some initial optimism, in the early days after those summits, North Korea really shows no sign today of relinquishing its capability. To the contrary, all signs really point in the opposite direction. And of course, you may have read just this morning, North Korea test launched 2 short-range ballistic missiles off of its east coast, not the intercontinental range, just short-range missiles that went a couple of 100 miles. But it was a significant test because it was their first ballistic missile test in a year. This happened in part because North Korea tested some cruise missiles over the weekend, which prompted really no more than a shrug of indifference from Washington. And so it appears that the North Koreans decided to turn up the pressure just a little bit to get our attention. But needless to say, dealing with the North Korean nuclear situation will be one of the toughest problems that the Biden administration has to face. A second major problem is Iran, of course. Iran is a different issue because its nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities are really nowhere near those of North Korea. Iran does not have nuclear weapons, but it does have a similar degree of hostility toward the United States. And it's located in a much more volatile region and has close ties with militant organizations that, of course, would be thrilled to get their hands on a nuclear weapon. The Obama administration, you might remember, signed a deal in 2015 that was intended to prevent Iran from acquiring the nuclear material needed to build a bomb. But the Trump administration withdrew from that deal in 2018, arguing that it would be able to pressure Iran into making greater concessions by reimposing sanctions. But Iran has gradually been taking steps to undo some of the limits that it agreed to in the deal, breaking key thresholds without going too far over the line. And so today, the status of the deal remains pretty uncertain. The Biden administration has indicated that it would like to return to the deal and, in fact, invited Iran to restart formal talks about bringing the United States back in. But the Iranians refused and said they won't engage in these talks until the United States lifts all the sanctions that the Trump administration had reimposed a few years ago, which the Biden administration said that it won't do before Iran agrees to allow the United States back in. So we're at somewhat of an impasse right now, and I imagine you'll want to talk a little bit more about that deal in the Q&A. So I'll move here. Sorry, I got these pictures backwards. There's your picture of Iran. This picture is a different one. This is a Russian cruise missile. The case of Russia is a case of both good news and bad news. First, I'll give you the bad news. In 1987, the United States and the Soviet Union signed a treaty called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the INF Treaty, which is kind of a mouthful, but it was a very significant treaty designed to eliminate nuclear weapons that were seen as particularly destabilizing. And this was significant because it was the first treaty that the Americans and the Soviets signed that actually reduced, rather than simply capped, American and Soviet nuclear arsenals. But the United States accused for many years, under multiple administrations, accused Russia of violating the INF Treaty by developing this cruise missile that you see here on your screen, a nuclear cruise missile that was prohibited by the treaty. And so the United States withdrew from it in 2019, and the treaty is now expired. So that's a bad news. On the bright side, the United States and Russia just a few weeks ago extended what is the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the two countries, about a week and a half before that treaty was set to expire. That treaty is called the New START Treaty, and it limits both sides' strategic nuclear arsenals to under 2,000 weapons each. And that sounds like a lot, but to put that in perspective, at the height of the Cold War in the 1970s, the US and the Soviets combined for a total of more than 70,000 nuclear weapons together. So to reduce both sides' arsenals under 2,000 is a major achievement. And so this treaty keeps their arsenals there for 5 more years. And then lastly here, a final sort of issue that you're reading about in the news having to do with nuclear weapons. Although it's true that the United States and Russia have agreed to extend these limits on their arsenals, at the same time, most nuclear countries around the world are engaged right now in trying to modernize and improve their nuclear arsenals. And the United States is no exception. In fact, under the Obama administration, the United States undertook an initiative to modernize the American nuclear arsenal, a wide-ranging program that includes building new nuclear warheads, a modified gravity bomb, which is the bomb you see here, a new stealthy long-range strike bomber, new ballistic missiles, a new nuclear cruise missile, and even new nuclear submarines, all under the umbrella of this big modernization program. This program in the end could end up costing something like $1.5 trillion, which used to be a number that caused us to blanch, but maybe not so much anymore in the era of trillion-dollar pandemic relief packages. But nonetheless, this is really an enormous amount of money that the United States is devoting to its nuclear program and its nuclear arsenal. And really, indeed, the modernization program, I think, reflects a broader trend in the United States toward expanding the role of nuclear weapons in US military strategy. And this is really something that the Trump administration and President Trump advocated very strongly from the very beginning. This is a quote from the 2016 presidential campaign when he talked about expanding the United States nuclear arsenal, which of course is a reversal from the policies that the Obama administration implemented. But this emphasis was also reflected here in remains the Defense Department's most recent nuclear strategy document. This document comes from 2018, so not even 3 years old yet. And it's known as the Nuclear Posture Review, which again, sounds, doesn't sound all that important, sounds like just sort of a bureaucratic a report that nobody reads, but this is a hugely significant document that determines the direction of American nuclear strategy. And in this document, it criticizes the efforts of previous administrations to reduce the size of the American arsenal, argued that the Obama administration was too sanguine, too optimistic, that the world would follow America's lead. And it concluded that the US should keep nuclear weapons at the core of its defense strategy. And so the Trump administration put into place and continued many of these programs, which have their own inertia and are very difficult to undo because of the degree of foresight and planning that has to happen in the Defense Department and the Department of Energy. And in fact, the world's nuclear powers have made largely similar decisions to the decision by the United States, which is now a decade old, to modernize its nuclear arsenal. So this chart tracks the status of the world's nuclear arsenals as of last year. And for today, we have 9 countries with nuclear weapons. And for the most part, all of these countries are either holding their nuclear arsenals steady. The US, the UK, France fall into that category, or they're actively increasing them, as is the case for China, North Korea, India, Pakistan. So nuclear weapons are not going away. And it's important, I think, that we as citizens be able to critically evaluate what our political leaders are trying to sell us, because this is literally a life and death issue. It may be an odd subject for most of you to consider and think about on a random Thursday night, but these are important issues, and a lot of money and literally lives are at stake in determining the future of American nuclear strategy. But of course, it's difficult for most people to pay attention to nuclear issues. One reason is that they're very technical, and they can seem very intimidating for people who aren't experts. And the experts, frankly, are usually no help at all, inventing all kinds of impenetrable jargon and acronyms, terms like the Nuclear Posture Review that really add more confusion than clarity for your average voter, average American citizen. And another reason nuclear issues can be challenging, I think, is they don't map cleanly onto partisan lines. Of course, these days, for a long time, really, everything has a partisan tinge to it. From the car you drive, to the bands you listen to whether you wear a mask, there's a partisan implication, a partisan shade that's associated with all those choices. But nuclear issues really don't break down so cleanly along these partisan lines. There's no clear conservative position or liberal position on nuclear deterrence and nuclear strategy. So you might be surprised to learn, or maybe not, that most nuclear arms control agreements have been signed by Republicans, not by Democrats. Although stereotypically you might think Democrats tend to favor nuclear arms control more, you should credit Republican presidents for signing those agreements. And on the other hand, Democratic administrations have been responsible for developing some of the most aggressive or offensive nuclear weapons technologies. The Carter administration, for example. The Obama administration signed a major arms control agreement with Russia. This is the New START treaty that President Biden just renewed, but also at the same time launched this $1 trillion nuclear modernization program that is underway today. So the party lines really are not at all clear, which in one way is a virtue, is one of the last remaining, I think, issues that doesn't have a clear partisan divide to it. But also the downside is that for most citizens, it makes it very difficult to know where you stand because you can't just take your cues from the political leaders that you support. Partisanship, for all its downsides, can actually be a great heuristic sometimes to help us decipher complicated policy issues. But in this case, it's really no help at all. So let me take a few more minutes, if I can, and try to give you a little help in trying to understand the role of nuclear weapons in international relations. And what I've really done here is I've tried to compress about 28 lectures in my course on nuclear weapons and international security into about 10 or 15 minutes. So what I'd like to do is talk about three big insights that I think are interesting and useful from current research about nuclear security that I think have some important lessons for how we should think about nuclear issues today. Okay, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So let's start with what we know about this first issue here, the spread of nuclear weapons, the status of nuclear proliferation. President John F. Kennedy once predicted that by 1975, there would be 15 or 20 countries with nuclear weapons. And at the time, he was not saying anything controversial. His quote here reflected a broader belief at the height of the Cold War that nuclear weapons were spreading rapidly and could not be controlled. And it's easy to see why he believed this. At the time he was writing, or at the time he was speaking while he was president, he was really at the very beginning of a couple of decades of fairly rapid spread of nuclear weapons. By the 1990s, the number of nuclear powers had not gotten quite as far as he thought that they would, but had gone up to 12. And states on the watch list, states that were believed to be at a very high risk of acquiring nuclear weapons, included countries like Iran, of course still today, Iraq, Libya, Argentina and Brazil, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and of course, North Korea. Most of those states have dropped off the watch list. And since then, 4 countries have actually voluntarily given up their nuclear weapons, while just one new country, North Korea, has acquired nuclear weapons, has joined the nuclear club. So although Kennedy is really remembered for his optimism, here he was much too pessimistic. Nuclear proliferation is actually at its slowest rate right now since the nuclear age began. Why is that? What explains why Kennedy wasn't right? I think there are a couple of reasons here. One has to do with tools that we have for preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. And specifically, I'm talking about economic sanctions. Economic sanctions, although today are a widely used tool for preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, North Korea, Iran are targeted by international sanctions and have been for many years. This wasn't always the case. After India tested a nuclear device in 1974, the United States responded not by imposing economic sanctions, but by actually increasing aid and trade, not decreasing it. So when the United States imposed sanctions on South Africa in 1975 over its nuclear program, it actually marked the first time that we had ever done that. Throughout the 1970s, Congress adopted a number of measures that were designed to ban economic assistance, military aid, trade benefits, and other goodies to countries that exported or imported nuclear technologies that were on a prohibited list without proper safeguards. So those sanctions were imposed or have been imposed against a total of 7 countries, the countries you see here. Now here's the strange thing, is that really on this list, there are actually only 2 success stories, 2 clear successes. 3 of these countries South Africa, Pakistan, North Korea, of course, actually got nuclear weapons. And in two of the other two cases, Argentina and Brazil, the sanctions ended and were lifted without the countries ending their nuclear programs. And both Argentina and Brazil carried on their programs for some time. So this looks like sanctions don't have that great of a record, but I think this overlooks a couple of factors. One is that the United States and the international community has just gotten a lot better at imposing economic sanctions. As international trade has increased and globalization has expanded over the decades, with the United States at the core of the global economy, sanctions are just much more effective today. The United States just by itself can directly sanction countries that it wants to target, but also using what are called secondary sanctions, it can target foreign firms that do business with that country. And because most of those firms usually don't want to lose the ability to trade and do business in the American market, they choose compliance over trading with the targets of these sanctions. So Iran is a great example of a country that has been targeted and very effectively by economic sanctions, both from the United States as well as from other countries using multilateral sanctions from the UN Security Council and the European Union. And these sanctions impose significant costs on countries that want to violate their non-proliferation obligations. And then secondly, although you only have 7 cases here, and really only 2 clear success stories of countries that have been sanctioned and then either gave up their nuclear programs or did not acquire nuclear weapons, what we do have is an expectation, a universal expectation that countries that violate their non-proliferation obligations are going to be targeted with economic sanctions. And so that means that all these cases of success actually don't show up in this list because these are cases where sanctions didn't have to be imposed at all. So consider, for example, that today there are somewhere around maybe 40 or 50 countries around the world that are what we might call nuclear capable. They have access to nuclear materials, they have money, they have the scientific and the industrial base necessary for a nuclear program. So if they wanted to acquire a nuclear weapon, they could probably do it. But these states have chosen not to build nuclear weapons. And part of that has to do with the expectation of the economic consequences that would follow. And indeed, there are many cases where a mere threat of economic sanctions was very effective. So Taiwan and South Korea, for example, in the 1970s, both actually started exploratory nuclear programs where they sort of took the first steps toward acquiring a nuclear weapon. But after the threat of withdrawal of trade, as well as military assistance from the United States, they reconsidered and decided to stay non-nuclear. So these are success stories that don't show up on this list because they're sanctions that never had to be imposed. So that's one factor I think that plays a huge role. Here's a second factor, and that has to do with the spread of democracy and the demise of authoritarianism over the last several decades. One pattern that we've noticed in our research about the causes of nuclear proliferation is that dictators, leaders of authoritarian states, tend to be especially likely to be interested in acquiring nuclear weapons. And when we think about this, it probably makes sense. Nuclear weapons really are the ultimate status symbol. They're the pinnacle of power in an anarchic world. And for dictators and authoritarians who value this kind of status and value power above all else, then it makes sense that they might see nuclear weapons as something that they covet and want to acquire. They're not the only ones, to be sure, but it turns out that authoritarian states have at least explored the possibility of acquiring nuclear weapons at an unusually high rate compared to democratic states. Now, as authoritarian dictators have been gradually deposed, their nuclear programs have also been terminated, and these countries have fallen off the watch list. So a country like Iraq, agree or disagree with the Iraq war in 2003, But Iraq is not a country that is on the nuclear watch list anymore. Now, part of that has to do with the demise of Saddam, part of it for other reasons. But I think historically, these two trends tend to go hand in hand. The demise of authoritarianism and slowing in the rate of nuclear proliferation. Okay, so maybe that's a piece of good news about the spread of nuclear weapons. It's slowing, and to the extent that authoritarianism can be contained, although I think there are questions about that now and over the last several years, to the extent that it can be contained, the dangers of nuclear proliferation can be slowed as well. So let me give you a second piece of good news, I think, about the dangers of proliferation and the spread of nuclear weapons. It's well known, well understood that nuclear weapons have an important security benefit, right? They prevent aggression through deterrence. At least that's the belief. They are the ultimate insurance against invasion of your territory. But there's also a fear that nuclear weapons do something else, that they help countries commit aggression, not just prevent it. And this is one reason, of course, that we care about proliferation, is that we worry that countries that have nuclear weapons might be able to coerce their neighbors into giving up territory, changing their foreign policy in some way, deposing leaders even, or making other kinds of concessions by the threat of nuclear attack. And this is really the conventional view today, but it's a view that also has a very long pedigree. This comes from the earliest days of the nuclear age, where we find American leaders who believed that having nuclear weapons gave the United States the ability to push around America's adversaries. So Truman and Eisenhower, for example, both believed that nuclear weapons had helped the United States coerce the Soviet Union and China into making concessions during a variety of crises in the 1940s and 50s. And Eisenhower, of course, believed that the nuclear threats he had made at the end of the Korean War against China were ultimately responsible for bringing them to the negotiating table. And we see this claim being tossed around in contemporary debates too. Some people have warned us that if Iran were allowed to acquire nuclear weapons, for example, it would try to redraw the map of the Middle East. Not so much that we would see more war or conflict, it's more that we would see Iran's neighbors submitting to Iran's demands for fear of what might happen if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon. And of course, this is how American officials have feared and continue to fear how North Korea will use its nuclear weapons, not just for self-preservation and defense or deterrence, but for aggression, for coercion. And this is former Secretary of State Pompeo. But again, this is a bipartisan belief that North Korea's nuclear weapons are dangerous for this reason, because they give North Korea the ability to push its neighbors and maybe even the United States around. And this is a view that's widely adopted, not just in government, not just in the Pentagon, but also by academics who study nuclear security. Now, recently I co-wrote a book that tried to assess this claim. And in that book, my co-author and I asked whether it really has any historical basis. And so one thing we did in the book is we used a database of coercive threats. So cases where countries made these kinds of demands, all kinds of countries throughout the entire nuclear age, not just the United States, but also other nuclear powers like Russia and China, as well as coercive threats from non-nuclear powers as well. And with this database, we could ask just a very basic question. So when nuclear countries make coercive threats, how often do they work? How often do the targets of their threats comply with their demands? And how often do they refuse? If the fears of Mike Pompeo and others are correct, the nuclear states should actually be getting their way much more often. But what we found was kind of surprising. We found that it actually was not the case, that nuclear armed countries don't seem to have an advantage when they engage in this kind of coercive, aggressive diplomacy. Um, and then, another argument that we tried to assess in the book was that, well, maybe it's not just about having nuclear weapons, it's about having more nuclear weapons or better nuclear weapons than your adversary. And so we changed the criteria a little bit and compared countries that have what is commonly termed nuclear superiority, so a larger or more capable nuclear arsenal than their adversary, and compared their success rate to countries that made threats without enjoying that superiority. And we found something very similar, which is that nuclear armed or nuclear superior states aren't succeeding more often in coercive diplomacy. It does not appear to be the case that the targets of their threats just have to submit to their demands. Now, this is just a small piece of the evidence that we present in this book, but I think what this shows is that nuclear weapons just don't seem to play as big of a role in coercive diplomacy as is commonly believed. That doesn't mean it's not dangerous for Iran to potentially acquire a nuclear weapon, but it does mean that some of the fears that are out there don't appear to be supported by the historical evidence. Okay, now the bad news is that I've given you two pieces of good news. One piece of maybe not bad news, but something to moderate that claim is that even though nuclear weapons haven't proven to be that useful for coercion in the past, that is not stopping leaders today around the world from trying to come up with new and better nuclear weapons. And this relates to the third and sort of final key point that I want to leave you, which is that in the future, really even today, the nuclear weapons that will matter the most are the smallest nuclear weapons, not the largest. This is a picture of the test of the largest nuclear weapon that was ever constructed. This was a Soviet nuclear test of a weapon or device called Tsar Bomba in 1961. That test was 50 megatons or 50 million tons equivalent of TNT. So remember the hypothetical North Korean attack on New York that I talked about a moment ago that would kill a few 100,000 people. This weapon, had it been exploded on a place like New York, would kill maybe 20 times that number. So more than 8 million people. People 40 miles away from this explosion would get third-degree burns. This weapon was never deployed in the Soviet arsenal, but the US and the Soviets both developed and deployed weapons that over time grew increasingly powerful. And that's, of course, what we think of when we think of nuclear weapons. We think of these gigantic explosions that level entire cities and kill millions of people. But the fact is that nuclear weapons, of course, come in much smaller packages as well. And here's an example. The United States currently deploys a nuclear warhead on this gravity bomb, the B-61, that can produce a yield of just 2% of the explosive magnitude of the Hiroshima bomb. So, the bomb that was destroyed Hiroshima in 1945, this is 1/50th of that explosive power. So less than 1 kiloton of explosive force. And this has always been possible to do, but the benefits have been limited for a couple of reasons. There are really two major reasons you would want to use a nuclear weapon in a military sense. One reason is sort of stereotypical picture of mass destruction, right? You want to level a city, or at least threaten to be able to level a city, to intimidate your opponent or adversary into compliance. A low yield warhead like the B-61 is obviously not suitable for that. It's just too small. It doesn't have that sort of city leveling capability. It has a different function, and that's the second major military function of a nuclear weapon, which would be to destroy a hardened target. So like an underground communications bunker or a ballistic missile silo. Low yield warheads are much better at doing this, but to be able to use one effectively in this role, they need to be really accurate. So for a warhead like the B-61, you need to get this within less than 50 meters of your target. So really, really close. Right now, the most accurate US ballistic missile is a submarine-launched ballistic missile. I think it's actually on the slide here. Yeah, here we go. The Trident II has an accuracy of under 100 meters. And what that means is that 50% of the time, so half the time that you launch that missile against a target, half the time it will land within 100 meters or less of the target. So that's accurate, but not accurate enough for a low yield nuclear warhead to really destroy a hardened target. But the fact is that now the accuracy of ballistic missiles is dramatically improving at a very fast pace. It's possible now for, again, for a ballistic missile that is launched from 10,000 miles away to achieve an accuracy level within maybe 10 meters of its target. So from 10,000 miles away, you can place a ballistic missile or place a warhead within 10 meters of the place where you want to hit it. That's really an extraordinary change from 20 or 30 years ago. And in fact, the Nuclear Posture Review, that report from the Pentagon that we talked about earlier, calls for the United States to expand its arsenal of low-yield warheads. Why? Why would the United States want to do this? The answer is primarily a response to Russia. Russia's problem in a military sense is that if it gets into a conventional war in Europe or say the Baltics with the United States and NATO, it's likely to be outgunned in a conventional sense. So some people believe that Russia's strategy is to employ low-yield nuclear weapons in a conventional battle, either to destroy key conventional targets or even as just a demonstration attack to convince the United States and NATO to back off. So the Pentagon, in response, believes that it needs its own low-yield nuclear weapons to be able to respond in kind, or at least threaten to respond in kind, to try to prevent this kind of attack. And the idea is that responding with a disproportionately large nuclear response would not be credible, but responding in kind with an equally low-yield warhead would be more credible. So the commander of the US Strategic Command, for example, has advocated building many more of these low-yield weapons to give the United States options that it didn't have before, and that don't require manned aircraft to deliver. And this is only viable, it's worth pointing out, only viable because of dramatic and recent improvements in the accuracy of ballistic missiles. So the big picture here is that in the coming years, we're not going to be talking about gigantic city-sized, 50 megaton nuclear weapons. The weapons that are going to be driving the debate are small nuclear weapons, the ones that blur the line between what's conventional and what is nuclear. I've gone on for way too long, and I know many of you have questions and would like to talk about what's in the news today. So I think we at least have a few minutes, and Jonathan, I'll turn it back to you to feed some questions.
All right. Yeah, so if anyone in the audience has any questions, you can just give them to me in the chat. But while some of those come in, we have some questions that were submitted beforehand, starting with, has the threat of nuclear war decreased due to the election of Joe Biden?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. It depends, I suppose, on what you believe is, a potential cause of nuclear war. One striking fact about the Trump administration, again, agree or disagree, is that President Trump spoke much more openly about using nuclear weapons than really any president ever has. Even during the Cold War, the threat of nuclear deterrence or threat of nuclear war was always sort of there in the background, but American presidents spoke about it in very veiled language. Things like all options on the table, or there will be very severe responses. They really went way out of their way to avoid explicitly invoking nuclear weapons. And that was not the case with President Trump, who talked explicitly about using nuclear weapons against ISIS, talked about, of course, expanding the US nuclear capability, He tweeted threats against North Korea. You know, we will totally destroy North Korea, things like that. You know, so it depends on what you believe about the effect of those kinds of remarks. And I think there are really two views, and I'm not sure it's clear which one is correct. You know, one argument is that those kinds of comments raise the tension, increase the likelihood of a crisis, or, you know, raise the temperature of a crisis, so that if something goes wrong and there's some kind of misinformation or you know, some kind of accident in the middle of a crisis, then one side might interpret it as a nuclear attack. And so this is a big fear in the nuclear crisis with North Korea in early, 2017, that, you know, during a period of very high tension, what if there's an explosion on a North Korean missile base? Maybe that explosion was the result of an American strike. Maybe that explosion was a result of a missile malfunction. And in a period of high tension, when you have an American president threatening to totally destroy the country, it might be more likely to be misinterpreted as an actual attack. The alternative view, of course, and this was the Trump administration's view, was that explicit threats like that, you know, communicated American resolve and prevented North Korea and other countries from stepping out of line. So I think explicit language and, you know, sort of belligerent rhetoric about nuclear weapons, it really has these two countervailing effects. And again, I think it's not necessarily clear which one prevails, but it raises the tension, which could increase the likelihood of something going wrong. But on the other hand, part of the purpose is in fact to raise the tension to try to enhance deterrence. So, you know, that may seem like a sort of two-sided answer, but I think it really is the reality of international diplomacy. If it didn't have an effect of raising tension, I think those kinds of threats, they wouldn't be effective. There wouldn't be any reason to make them. So the tension is an intentional consequence. And I think clearly the Biden administration is less likely and sort of less prone to resort to that kind of rhetoric. But it really does have those two, I think, countervailing effects.
All right, question from the chat. How concerned should we be about non-state actors acquiring weapons from state actors?
I think we should be very concerned. I think we have been concerned for a very long time. I give an entire lecture in this course that I was telling you about on nuclear terrorism. And I decided to exclude it from this talk just because it gets so complicated and there's so many issues that you know, we would have to touch on. Look, I think the reality is that there are many terrorist organizations or militant groups that would love to have their hands on a nuclear weapon. I think it's less clear that countries, even countries that we worry about like Iran or Pakistan, have any interest in allowing those organizations to acquire nuclear weapons. So it's this continuous cat and mouse game where countries are trying to protect their arsenals, keep them secure, and militant organizations, you know, try to acquire them. You know, I think it's worth asking what interest a terrorist group might have in acquiring a nuclear weapon. You know, a transnational terrorist organization, you know, I think of Al-Qaeda or something like that, might have a clear interest, whereas a more regional organization like, say, Hezbollah, which you know, has as much of an interest in governing and acquiring territory and you know, trying to persuade sort of the average citizen to support it. An organization like that, I think, has less of an interest in acquiring a nuclear weapon. You know, some scholars argue that organizations like those don't want to cause, you know, mass casualty events because it would only undermine public support for them. So I don't think it's all militant or all terrorist organizations that we have to worry about. I do think there are some, but I also think that, you know, countries have a strong interest in preventing them from acquiring nuclear weapons, in part because forensic methods and technology are so good now that if a nuclear weapon were to be detonated by a terrorist organization, that nuclear material probably could be traced back to the country that provided it. And that's a huge disincentive to countries that might think, like North Korea, for example, that might think about trying to provide or sell nuclear material to a terrorist organization.
All right, another from the chat. China has a no first use policy for nuclear weapons. Do you see that continuing to maintain this policy for long term?
That's a great question. Yeah, so the no first use is a debate that's been going on for years, decades, and the policy is that a country adopting a no first use pledge promises not to be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. And of course, the United States has never made a no first use commitment. And the reason is that American nuclear strategy in Europe, in particular, NATO nuclear strategy, for many years, in part relied on the first use of nuclear weapons to deter Soviet conventional capabilities. And NATO officials continue to argue that it would be antithetical to NATO deterrence policy to adopt a no first use pledge. But China has a no first use pledge. It's a great cudgel for the Chinese to beat the Americans over the head with. What we don't know is whether it would hold up in a conflict. So, will the pledge continue? I expect yes. It's a great diplomatic tool. Would it actually prevail or actually be held up in hypothetical conflict in like the South China Sea with China? It's just hard to know. Maybe, maybe not. There are certainly circumstances where I could envision if, for example, there's a conflict and the American Navy is trying to target Chinese submarines, where submarine commanders might feel like they have sort of a use it or lose it type of moment, where if they don't use their nuclear weapons that are on board, they're going to be sunk and sent to the bottom of the sea. And that's a very dangerous type of situation, a choice that I hope no Chinese submarine commander ever has to confront. But in a conflict, they probably would have to confront that, because targeting Chinese submarines, I expect, would be a big part of American naval strategy. And so at that point, does the no first use pledge hold? I think we just don't know. And that's the difficulty with the pledge, is that it holds until it doesn't.
All right, I think we have time for one more quick one, although I don't know how. I feel like this could be a pretty expansive question, but is the US postured correctly to confront current nuclear and international threats? And if not, what do you see as the biggest gap?
That's a great question. A very long question, I think. So, again, it depends on what you consider the most likely threats. I think American nuclear posture considers the use of nuclear weapons to be a very last resort type of event. And I think that's the correct posture. It should be a last resort. In the most dire of circumstances are the only ones where American leaders should consider using nuclear weapons. Now, the defining feature of American nuclear posture is expansive capabilities, if I had to summarize it. The United States has nuclear weapons, thousands of nuclear weapons that are deployed on what's known as the triad, right? Ground-based ballistic missiles, bombers in the air, and submarines that are out at sea. Those nuclear weapons, right, are deployed so across a range of platforms, ballistic missiles, gravity bombs, submarine launched missiles, soon to be naval launched cruise missiles. And those weapons come in a variety of forms. So very, low yield nuclear weapons, as well as very high powered 1.2 megaton nuclear warheads. And the question is, whether the United States needs such an expansive range of capabilities. Former military leaders, former secretaries of defense have argued for getting rid of one or more legs of the triad, arguing that they're too expensive or too vulnerable. So for example, some, this is not, sort of pie in the sky recommendation of, a anti-war organization. These are recommendations of former secretaries of defense that the United States draw down to, for example, just a submarine-launched nuclear deterrent. So get rid of the bombers, which could be destroyed on the ground and are big and slow. Get rid of the intercontinental ballistic missiles that are land-based because they're also vulnerable to attack, and strictly rely on submarine-launched ballistic missiles. So in a crisis, the United States at all times has some nuclear-armed submarines out at sea. Those are extremely difficult to find and even more difficult to track. So that is a secure deterrent, according to this argument. And if self-defense and a last resort situation is the only type of situation where US leaders really would consider using nuclear weapons, according to this argument, those weapons are more than enough to do the job. You put dozens of nuclear weapons out in a single Ohio-class submarine. They sit out there in the ocean undetected. Nobody can find them. They're not vulnerable, and they're useful as a deterrent. Others, of course, argue that this isn't adequate, that the United States needs a range of responses that, threatening only to use large ballistic missiles or large warheads is just not credible. Since the 1970s, and really even before then, the 1960s, American leaders have worried that threatening to destroy an adversary's city in response to a conventional attack is just not credible. It would be almost certainly a violation of international law. It would be an enormous international event, humanitarian catastrophe. No American leader wants that on his conscience. And so the argument is that the US needs a greater range of options at a much lower level to be able to credibly threaten to retaliate against, say, a Russian nuclear attack, a low-yield nuclear attack in a hypothetical conflict with NATO. I think that's really the range of views. That's, I think, highly oversimplifying it. But the answer is nobody knows who's right. Nobody knows exactly what are the circumstances under which the United States might have to use nuclear weapons. Nobody knows if a Russian leader, if Vladimir Putin, would actually be willing to use them. And nobody knows if the threat to retaliate against, soft targets is the lexicon, which really means cities and people, is a credible threat in conflict with Russia or China. That's somewhat of a cop-out answer, but your answer to the question depends on what you see as the proper threat that needs to be responded to, and what is the level of US credibility. These debates have been going on for literally more than half a century. Like I said, I have a couple of lectures that I give strictly on this question of deterrence and credibility, and the range of nuclear strategies, depending on the assumptions that you adopt about who is your adversary, what kind of threat do they see as credible, that leads to different conclusions about the proper nuclear posture to respond to it. And American leaders have calculated that the proper nuclear posture is one that is more expansive, has a range of capabilities and a range of options.
All right. Well, that's great. That's our time. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, giving us your time and your expertise on this topic on this Thursday evening. Thanks to all of you for joining the UVA Club of Richmond. If you want any more information, you can find us at rvawhos.org. That's our website. You can find all of our future events and membership sign up there. So again, just want to thank Todd one more time and thank all of you for joining us. Have a good night.
Thank you all so much for having me. Have a great night.